Captain Elias Drake had always prided himself on being humanity's sharpest weapon, trained for diplomacy, but capable of eliminating threats with cold efficiency when words failed. The human race had always been a diplomatic species, but Drake's unique talents made him the go-to emissary when delicate peace negotiations required a strong hand. His latest mission, however, was unlike any other. The war between the Zarathians and the Valkyrie had lasted for centuries, each race too proud to yield, too arrogant to compromise. The Zarathians, with their gleaming silver cities and towering war machines, had no interest in negotiating peace. Their thirst for conquest was insatiable. The Valkyrie, on the other hand, had an ancient code of honor. They fought not just to win but to protect what they considered sacred, an ideal that had driven their people into an endless conflict with their enemies. As a result, the galaxy teetered on the brink of all-out war. With human interests on the line, Elias was dispatched as a neutral mediator to broker a truce between the two factions. He didn't expect it to be easy, but he had the reputation to back his efforts. With the support of his diplomatic skills and a small team of elite soldiers, he arrived on the planet Charath, the war-torn world that served as the site for this critical peace summit. Elias stepped off the transport ship, surveying the barren, ash-covered landscape. Charath was a world that had seen too many battles. Once a lush, vibrant planet, it was now a place of endless ruins, haunted by the scars of warfare. His boots crunched on the dry earth as he made his way toward the towering citadel where the summit would take place. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his contact, a member of the Valkyrie delegation, a tall, armored figure with glowing blue eyes. "We are ready to begin, Captain," the Valkyrie said, his voice gruff, as if the centuries of war had weathered both his body and spirit. Elias nodded, though his mind was already working. He had studied the Zarathians and the Valkyrie for years. He knew how each species would react under pressure. He was prepared for the worst, but he held out hope for the best. His mission was simple: stop the war before it reached a boiling point that would engulf the galaxy. The summit began with civil exchanges, but Elias felt the tension crackling in the air. The Zarathian representatives, sleek and methodical, sat with cold detachment, their eyes scanning every word spoken as if searching for weaknesses. The Valkyrie, in contrast, wore their pride-like armor, their postures rigid, their gazes intense, filled with distrust. The alien leaders were barely concealing their disdain for each other, and Elias could see the precarious balance of power teetering dangerously. An hour into the summit, Elias realized that no diplomatic gesture, no clever wordplay, could bridge the gap between these two species. The Zarathians were unwilling to compromise on any issue that threatened their technological supremacy, while the Valkyrie's demands for honor and the protection of their sacred lands were non-negotiable. It was clear that the summit had reached an impasse. Just as Elias began considering alternative methods, perhaps appealing to the factions' shared desire to preserve their civilization, everything erupted into chaos. A loud explosion shook the building, and before Elias could react, the conference room doors burst open. Zarathian soldiers, in their silvery battle armor, stormed in, weapons raised. The Valkyrie leaders leapt to their feet, their eyes blazing with fury, as they drew their energy blades. The delicate balance of peace shattered in an instant, and war had broken out within the walls of what was supposed to be a neutral meeting. In the confusion, Elias acted without hesitation. He reached for his sidearm, a state-of-the-art plasma rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air, but it did little to calm the situation. The Valkyrie and Zarathians were too far gone in their rage. And then he saw her, Ryla, a member of the Valkyrie Council. She was a striking woman, tall and imposing, with battle scars marking her face as a testament to her years of leadership. She was moving toward the fray, her warriors rallying behind her. Her strength was evident, but Elias saw something else too, a flash of vulnerability, as she ducked behind a column, blood dripping from a wound in her side. Elias's heart skipped a beat. She was the key to peace. If she died, the Valkyrie would never agree to any truce, and the galaxy would fall into a war that would stretch for eons. But there was no time for hesitation. The moment stretched in front of him like a crossroads. Without thinking, he dashed toward her, dodging plasma bolts as they whizzed past him, his mind only focused on her survival. His soldiers were busy defending the other Valkyrie delegates, but Elias knew that if he didn't act fast, it would be too late. When he reached Ryla, she was slumped against the pillar, struggling to stay conscious. Blood poured from her side, and she looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "You came for me?" she whispered. Elias didn't waste time with words. Instead, he tore a piece of cloth from his uniform and pressed it against her wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He could feel the heat of her blood soaking through the fabric, the pounding of his own heart in his ears. There was only one option left. He had to give her his blood. He could heal faster than most due to his enhanced human physiology, but this sacrifice could be deadly. "This is going to hurt, but it's the only way," Elias muttered, ripping a sharp edge from his combat knife and slicing open his own palm. He cupped his hand over the wound, his blood dripping onto her skin. Her eyes widened. You would sacrifice yourself for me?" Elias nodded, his voice steady despite the pain. "It's the only way to save you. If you die, so does the peace we fought for. So does everything." With a deep breath, he pressed his hand firmly against her side, the flow of his blood mingling with hers. A surge of energy passed between them, and Elias felt the strain of his own life force being drained, but he held on. Ryla's breathing slowed as the wound began to heal. The color returned to her face, and she looked at him, awe and gratitude filling her eyes. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped, just the two of them, surrounded by the chaos of war, yet connected by the blood of a human willing to sacrifice everything for her. Ryla's lips parted in a silent thank you, and Elias could feel the weight of the future pressing upon them. But before she could speak, the door exploded open again, and a Zarathian warrior strode in, weapon raised. Elias had no time to react. The summit on Charath was supposed to be the final attempt to save the planet, and perhaps the galaxy, from further devastation. But Elias Drake, though highly skilled in both diplomacy and combat, was walking into a hornet's nest. The Zarathians and the Valkyrie were too deeply entrenched in their hatred, too obsessed with their pride, to give up on centuries of war. But the stakes were high, and Elias knew that if peace could not be achieved here, the galaxy would suffer irreparably. The diplomat and warrior inside him both braced for the worst. The first thing Elias noticed as he walked into the war-torn hall of negotiation was the towering figure of Zarathian High Commander, Zalkar Thos. Standing at nearly 9 feet tall, the Zarathian was a mass of black, crystalline armor that gleamed in the dim light. His species was known for their advanced technology, their penchant for heavy weaponry, and their merciless tactics. The Zarathians were a race of conquerors, cold, calculating, and driven by an unrelenting desire to expand their empire at any cost. Zalkar's face, if it could be called a face, was hidden behind a black visor that reflected Elias's own image back at him like a glassy mirror. His voice, however, was unmistakably menacing, deep and gravelly, like the rumble of distant thunder. "We do not need your interference, human," Zalkar sneered, his eyes flashing as he looked down at Elias with a gaze filled with disdain. "We will not bow to the Valkyrie, nor will we allow them to dictate terms to us. You can either leave now, or we'll see how your kind fares when faced with the wrath of the Zarathian Empire." Elias remained calm, his face impassive as he met Zalkar's gaze. "This isn't about bowing to anyone, Zalkar. It's about saving your people from annihilation. You can keep fighting, but your planet is crumbling. Your civilization will be nothing more than a charred memory." The Zarathian's lip curled in a snarl, but before he could respond, Elias turned his attention to the other side of the room. The Valkyrie, by contrast, were a much smaller, more physically fragile race. Their bodies were sleek and elegant, their skin a deep shade of violet that shimmered in the light. The Valkyrie were humanoid, but their proportions were more lithe than those of humans, their long, slender limbs giving them an almost ethereal appearance. Their culture was centered on honor and spirituality, values that Elias respected, even if their militaristic approach to defending those values had brought them into conflict with the Zarathians. At the head of the Valkyrie delegation was their leader, Karena Valen. She was a striking figure, with her long, flowing hair that gleamed like starlight, and eyes that shone with an intense, almost otherworldly wisdom. Karenna was smaller than Elias by a head, but there was no mistaking the power in her presence. She radiated authority, a regal calm that belied the deep sorrow of a leader caught in an endless war. Karenna's voice was soft, yet commanding. "Captain Drake." She greeted him with a nod, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet sadness. "We know what you are trying to do, but our people have suffered too long at the hands of the Zarathians. They do not understand peace, they only understand destruction. If you think you can reason with them, you are wasting your time." "I'm not here to reason with them," Elias replied. "I'm here to force them to listen. You can't win this war, Karenna. This endless cycle of violence will destroy both of your peoples. I can broker a truce if you're willing to stop fighting for one moment." The two factions, Zarathian and Varkari, were at an impasse. As Elias sat down at the large negotiating table, he could feel the tension in the air. The Zarathians refused to yield on any of their demands, each one more outrageous than the last. They demanded that the Varkari surrender vast swaths of territory, a concession the Varkari were unwilling to accept. In turn, the Varkari insisted that the Zarathians pay reparations for the damages they had caused during the war. But neither side was willing to compromise. Minutes turned into hours as the debate raged on, and Elias felt the pressure building. His words were falling on deaf ears. The clock was ticking, and he knew that if the two sides didn't come to an agreement soon, the galaxy's last hope for peace would be lost. It was then that the first explosion rocked the room. The blast came from the rear of the chamber, sending a wave of shock and debris across the room. Elias was thrown to the floor as smoke and dust filled the air. His heart raced as he scrambled to get to his feet, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation. The chaos was instantaneous. Varkari soldiers and Zarathian guards drew their weapons, their instincts kicking in as they prepared for a fight. Elias's mind raced. Who could have triggered this? A third party? An extremist faction looking to sabotage the peace talks? The blast had come too quickly, too precisely, and the timing felt deliberate. There was no time to waste. He sprang to his feet, scanning the room for any sign of the enemy. But before he could react, a second explosion rocked the building. The walls trembled as debris rained down from above. Screams echoed in the chaos as both factions turned on each other. This wasn't a sabotage, it was an ambush. In the middle of the carnage, Elias's eyes locked on something, or rather, someone, through the dust and smoke. A figure was stumbling toward him, covered in blood. It was Karenna. Karenna had been caught in the explosion. Her violet skin was streaked with crimson, and her elegant form staggered under the weight of her injuries. Her eyes were wide, full of pain and disbelief, as she tried to keep herself upright. The Varkari leader's face contorted in agony as she fell to her knees, clearly struggling to breathe. Elias didn't hesitate. He charged toward her, weaving through the chaos of battle as he reached her side. Her breath was shallow, and she was losing blood fast. "You need to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent as he knelt beside her. Karenna shook her head, her lips trembling as she reached out weakly toward him. "No, the peace, it's too late for that now. They've sabotaged everything. You're not dying here," Elias declared firmly. He could hear the sounds of the fight closing in on them, but his focus was entirely on her. "I'll save you." Karenna's eyes fluttered, and her hand clutched at Elias's arm. She had only moments left, but there was no time to get her to safety. In that instant, Elias made a split-second decision. He didn't hesitate. Without thinking twice, he ripped open the sleeve of his uniform and pressed his arm against Karenna's injured side. He gritted his teeth and pulled a concealed medical syringe from his belt. His blood, his genetic makeup, had been altered for such an emergency. A blood transfusion, one from his own altered blood, could save her life long enough to get her out of danger. With no time to waste, Elias injected her with his blood. Her eyes went wide with surprise, but she didn't protest. Her breath steadied as the transfusion began to take effect. The human blood coursed through her veins, its restorative properties working faster than anything she'd known. But the strain on her body was immense, and Elias knew it was a risk, a gamble. "Stay with me," Elias urged, his voice low but firm as he pressed his arm around her shoulder, pulling her into a protective embrace. Through the haze of battle, he felt the first signs of success. Karena's pulse steadied. Her breathing slowed, and the color began to return to her cheeks. But the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. The negotiation had taken a turn for the worse. Elias Drake stood at the center of the war-torn hall, feeling the tension in the air like a thick fog. The peace summit was rapidly spiraling out of control. The Zarathian commander, Zal-Kurthas, had been adamant in his refusal to negotiate. His arrogance and bloodlust were palpable, and the Varkari, though honorable, were growing desperate. Tensions were high, and violence seemed inevitable. Elias had hoped that his diplomatic skills could make a difference, but now it was clear that words alone would not suffice. The room, once meant to be a neutral space for peace talks, had devolved into a battlefield. A stray blaster shot from a Zarathian officer had struck one of the Varkari leaders, injuring her severely. The hall erupted in chaos as both factions drew weapons, shouting insults and preparing for all-out conflict. Elias instinctively reached for his sidearm, but it was not his weapon that would make the difference today. He needed something far more personal, something far more dangerous. Then, in the midst of the chaos, he saw her. She was a Varkari warrior, tall and regal, with flowing violet hair that shimmered like the auroras in a storm. Her features were sharp, defined by an elegance that stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the conflict. Her name was Asha, a leader of her people and one of the few who still believed in the possibility of peace. But now, her body lay crumpled on the cold, cracked floor of the negotiation hall, blood spilling from the wound in her side. The sound of blaster fire echoed in the distance, but Elias had no time to consider the ongoing battle. Asha's breathing was shallow, her eyes fluttering as she tried to stay conscious. She looked up at Elias, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. He could tell that the wound was serious. Even though the Varkari were a tough race, their biology wasn't immune to the kind of weaponry that the Zarathians wielded. "Please," Asha whispered, her voice weak. "You must leave. This is a lost cause." "No," Elias said firmly, kneeling beside her. His heart raced. He had come here to save lives, not to watch them be snuffed out. "You're not going to die here. Not while I still have something to give." She shook her head, her lips pale from the blood loss. "You cannot save me, this is not your fight." "You're wrong," Elias replied, his voice filled with intensity. He could see in her eyes that she was holding on to life with every ounce of strength she had left. But he knew deep down that without immediate medical intervention, she wouldn't survive. He couldn't let that happen. Not when so much was at stake. There was a moment of silence between them, the distant sounds of the battle fading as Elias's mind raced for a solution. He had been trained for many things, fighting, diplomacy, leadership, but this was different. This was personal. If he didn't act quickly, Asha would be lost, and the truce would die with her. And with the death of the truce would come the death of thousands, perhaps millions. In that moment, an idea hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. It was risky, dangerous, and nearly insane, but it was his only choice. The Varkari were a species known for their regenerative abilities, but only under very specific conditions. Their healing process required a powerful, life-affirming energy, something Elias had read about in the diplomatic reports, something he had learned in passing but never truly understood until now. Blood. Human blood. Elias wasn't entirely sure of the full extent of the Varkari's physiology, but he knew this much: the blood of a human, particularly one whose DNA contained certain rare and potent biological markers, had an almost miraculous effect on the Varkari's healing abilities. It was why humans had been sought after as slave labor during the early days of the war, and why the Zarathians had a vested interest in eradicating humanity from the galaxy. But Elias wasn't a slave. He wasn't a pawn in anyone's game. He was humanity's weapon, and if sacrificing a part of himself would save a life, and perhaps the galaxy, then he would do it without hesitation. "I'm going to help you," he said, his voice resolute. "But you have to trust me. Let me help you live." Asha's eyes widened, fear and confusion flashing in her expression. You don't understand. You cannot." "I understand more than you think," Elias interrupted, his voice intense. He carefully removed his jacket, exposing his forearm. The sleek, silver-toned skin of his suit shimmered in the dim light, but his blood was still human, and it was still something Asha needed to survive. "You need this to live?" Asha's face twisted in disbelief. "No. You'll die, human. If you give me your blood, you'll—" "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm saving you, whether you like it or not." Elias cut off the communication line between the Zarathian and Vakari factions before they could respond to the growing chaos, ensuring that no one would interfere. The choice was made. He reached for his wrist blade, the sleek, lethal weapon concealed in his sleeve, and with a sharp, controlled motion, he slashed open a vein on his forearm. Pain shot through him for a brief moment as blood flowed freely from the wound. He gritted his teeth, determined not to show weakness in front of the warrior he was saving. Asha gasped in shock as she saw the crimson liquid drip onto the floor. "You're mad!" she cried. "You'll die." "I'm not going to die," Elias said calmly, his voice tinged with the conviction that had gotten him through countless missions before. "But you will if you don't drink this." Without another word, he took her hand and pressed it against his bleeding arm. Asha recoiled at first, but desperation soon overtook her. Her pale lips parted, and with a mixture of disbelief and instinct, she began to drink. The effect was almost immediate. As soon as the blood touched her lips, her body jerked violently, her pupils dilating as a warm, powerful surge of energy coursed through her. Elias winced at the sight. The regenerative process was intense, almost as though Asha's body were coming alive in real time, repairing itself at an astonishing rate. Her breath steadied, and her skin began to regain its healthy tone. The blood flowed through her with unnatural speed, and the wound in her side began to close, healing before his very eyes. Asha's eyes locked onto his, filled with awe and gratitude. You saved me." Elias gave her a weak smile, his face pale from the blood loss. "I wasn't about to let you die. Not when we still have a chance to save everyone." Asha tried to sit up, her strength rapidly returning. "But it's not over yet," Elias interrupted. "We need to finish what we started." The pain was starting to hit him now, his vision blurring, but he remained focused. They had no time for this to be anything more than a fleeting moment of respite. There was still work to be done, and he wasn't about to stop now. Asha might have been healed, but the battle for peace, and for survival, was just beginning. The chaos of the negotiation hall seemed to fall away the moment Elias knelt beside Asha. The cold, metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid stench of burnt ozone and ionized air, yet in that single moment, Elias only had one thought: save her. He had already given more of himself than he ever thought possible, sacrificing his own blood to stabilize her, but she was still fading, her breathing shallow, her eyes dimming. The momentary feeling of helplessness clawed at him, but he couldn't allow it. He was a soldier, a diplomat. He had to see this through. Asha's violet eyes fluttered open, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You should have let me die," she whispered, her voice hoarse, weakened from the pain. Elias frowned, pressing a palm to the side of her face, feeling the warmth of her skin. "I couldn't do that," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You're too important to both our people. You're the key to peace. Don't give up now." Her lips curled slightly, the faintest trace of a smile. Despite her physical agony, there was something else there, something that spoke of admiration, gratitude, perhaps even something deeper. "You risked everything for me," she said. "Even your life." "Why?" Elias hesitated. He wasn't used to showing his emotions so openly, but in this moment, he felt the weight of his actions, both the sacrifice and the unspoken promise he had made. He knew the risks when he saved her, the potential for loss. But he also knew that he couldn't stand by and watch another innocent life, another leader, be taken in the name of senseless violence. I did it because I believe in peace. I believe in you, Elias said softly. I believe that we can find a way to end this war. I won't give up on that. Asha's hand, weak and trembling, reached up to touch his. The connection between them, though born out of bloodshed and desperation, felt real. It was as if she could sense his resolve, the depth of his commitment not just to peace but to her. She gazed at him with a new understanding, her pain forgotten, or at least momentarily pushed aside. Then I will not die, she said, her voice gaining strength. I will fight. For the peace you have shown me. For the hope you've given me. Elias's heart surged with relief. She was still alive, and if there was a chance to save her, he would make it happen. He pressed his fingers to her wound, applying pressure, trying to stem the bleeding. But the real danger was over. The blood he had given her earlier was already working its magic. He had sacrificed a part of himself, not just blood, but energy, vitality, to save her life. Now she was recovering, and the bond between them, forged in that life-or-death moment, felt almost sacred. But then something unexpected happened. Asha's grip on his hand tightened, and her eyes searched his with a newfound intensity. Elias, there is something I must offer you, she said, her voice low but urgent. For what you have done, for what you've given, there is a debt I must repay. Elias frowned, unsure of what she meant. There's no debt to repay. I did what anyone would do. She shook her head slightly, her violet eyes never leaving his. No. You have given more than anyone could ever ask of you. And it is not just your blood that I owe, Elias. It is my heart. The words caught him off guard. He had not expected this, not in the heat of battle, nor in the aftermath of such a chaotic and dangerous situation. And yet, as he looked into her eyes, there was something undeniable there, a deep, consuming connection that had formed between them in the heat of the moment. For a long moment neither spoke. The world around them seemed to fade. The sounds of fighting in the distance were drowned out by the beating of his own heart, which seemed to race in time with hers. It was as if everything had led to this moment, this strange, unexpected intersection of duty, sacrifice, and something much more primal. Asha's breathing steadied, and her expression softened. She raised herself slightly, wincing but determined. You saved my life, she whispered, her voice barely audible now, but it held a depth of emotion that Elias couldn't ignore. In doing so, you have bound yourself to me. I will honor this bond, Elias. I will give you what no other can. Elias was silent, but his heart pounded in his chest. Her words were both a promise and an offer, a deep and intimate one, far beyond the realm of diplomacy and politics. He could feel her sincerity, the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't just speaking in metaphors. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something that transcended the brutal conflict that had brought them together. For a moment, Elias considered what she was offering. He had risked his life for her, not just as a soldier, but as a man. The sacrifice of his blood, the desperate act to save her life, had forged a connection that neither of them could deny. But what did that connection mean? Was it just a bond born of survival, or was it something deeper, something neither of them could fully comprehend? Asha slowly closed the gap between them, her hand still in his. You have given me your life, Elias, she said softly, her breath warm against his skin. Now let me give you my heart. The room around them seemed to vanish as she leaned in, her lips meeting his. It was soft at first, tentative, like the first touch of a storm on the horizon, but as the kiss deepened, it became something more, something that transcended the chaos and bloodshed that had brought them to this point. In that kiss, there was no war. There were no enemies, no factions, no battle for control. There was only the connection they had forged, the understanding that they had given each other something irreplaceable. For Elias, it felt like a promise that, despite the odds, they had found something worth fighting for. And for Asha, It was a reward she had never expected but could not deny, a love born of sacrifice and shared purpose. When they finally parted, their faces were close, breath mingling in the air between them. Elias could feel the warmth of her body against his, and he realized, in that moment, that the peace they sought was no longer just a political goal. It was something personal, something that ran deeper than diplomacy. They had found each other in the ashes of war, and together, they would rebuild something worth saving. "Thank you," Asha whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "For everything." Elias smiled, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "It's not over yet," he said softly. "But for the first time, I believe it can be." And with that, they turned together toward the future, one that neither of them could have predicted but both were now determined to shape.